I gave the original AYN Odin just a ton of flack for being a bad value, and I still stand by that opinion. But for the AYN Odin 2, I feel like this poses a much greater value proposition, a lot more performance for the money than any other option currently on the market. For this video, I purchased the AYN Odin 2 base model at the early bird pricing, so I got it for around $290 something, which, because I'm not made of money, I figured would be probably the more representative of what most people are going to buy. So I did all my testing and all that on the 8GB model of the AYN Odin 2, and just before we start getting into the numbers and stuff of this device, to start, the overall user experience, the UI of the device, is very similar to what we've been used to with all the other AYN Odin devices, and it's just very familiar. It's it's one of my favorite pre-installed sort of launcher setups. And something I do appreciate, it pre-downloads a bunch of the emulators for you. It has a bunch of like recommended and emulator specific ones, but for me personally, I ended up manually downloading Aether SX2 and manually downloading Skyline for this for the Odin 2, mainly because so I could get the most up-to-date versions of both of those. I went with the normal, the version of Dolphin that comes pre-installed, mainly because I wasn't gonna play a lot of GameCube or anything like that, or Wii games. They're just never been the best experience on like emulation devices. But that, I'll get into the numbers of what I ended up having with this handheld. With the physical design of the device, it is very similar to the previous one, a tad larger than the Odin 1, but it's still smaller than the Nintendo Switch, and about the same size as a Switch Lite, significantly smaller than something like the Steam Deck or the ROG Ally. So it is still a very, portable friendly device. Some of the specs about the version I have: it has an 8,000 mAh battery, 8GB of RAM, 128GB worth of storage, and a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. So a pretty powerful processor. I think it's the sixth or seventh most powerful device available right now. And with all these devices coming out, I just was so curious to see how this AYN Odin 2 really stacks up. And some of you might know my opinion on this device if you saw my recent top 10 devices of 2023 video. I actually really like this device. It stacks up very well, and it's really hard to find an alternative that offers the same level of performance. This device comes in an 8, 12, and 16GB model, and for storage it has 128, 256, and 512GB worth of storage. All models have the same Snapdragon Gen 2 processor. It has a microSD card slot, a mini HDMI port, and of course USB-C charging. And overall, a pretty feature-rich device. Always appreciated to have that mini HDMI port on it, as always. I've never personally utilized it whenever I've seen it on other devices I've owned, but it's always a nice to have for those of you out there who make use of that kind of feature. Moving on to the performance of the device. The Odin 2 can, of course, play anything from the first 3 generations of game consoles. That means NES, Super Nintendo, N64, just some of the easiest stuff you can possibly think of to run. And it could obviously play Genesis, Saturn flawlessly, Dreamcast pretty good, flawlessly. I was initially going to be quite concerned with N64, but then I thought back with how the Odin 1 performed, and all my worries were just immediately for nothing. The Odin 2 has flawless N64 performance. I could not find a single game that did not run very well on the Odin 2. And even more surprising, I would say not surprising actually, the GameCube and PS2 performance was just phenomenal. you could already get away with on the Odin 1 playing GameCube and PS2 games with some frame hitching and from some stuttering from time to time. But on the Odin 2, I would say it's near flawless, providing some of the best emulation experience I have ever seen on a handheld Android device. This thing is so powerful, and it doesn't even need to have the fans at 100% to do so. I played most of my time on 50% fan power, so it wasn't too loud, but it was providing a lot of cooling. And I think you could get away with that from basically anything up to GameCube and PS2. Anything higher than that would require you to turn on the fan near at like maximum performance mode. And for that, going into Nintendo Switch emulation, which may be a touchy subject for some of you, but I only test games that I own, so bear that in mind. I tested a nice handful of games from easy to run to very hard to run games, and 8 gigs on the base model, you can play some Switch games. I wouldn't say every single Switch game, but anything basic, like you can play Super Mario Wonder on it very well. New Super Mario Bros. U, Mario Odyssey runs fairly well. But go something open world, like Tears of the Kingdom, you start to run into some frame rate problems, and you're limited by the RAM. And judging by other reviews I've seen that from people who had the more, pro models and stuff like that, it doesn't necessarily get better. And I think that's the crux of this device. If you're buying it for Nintendo Switch emulation, it's important to keep in mind to buy a device for what it is now and not buy it in the hopes of what it could be in the future. Because yes, the Nintendo Switch emulation could be amazing 2 or 3 years from now, when the software finally catches up to the hardware. Because there's no doubt in my mind that the Odin 2 could flawlessly run Switch games once the emulator itself has more development behind it. But you should never buy a device based on the promise of what's going to happen to it in the future. So as it stands right now, yes, it can play a good amount of Switch games, but it won't be able to play, especially if you have the base model, it won't be able to play everything. And it will take some finagling to get it to work. You got to download these custom drivers to get good performance. You got to make sure you stay up to date on Skyline. You got to get your product keys and title keys and all that stuff, which is never an easy thing to do. It has gotten better with time. I remember when Skyline first came out, there was so much rigmarole to get it to work. And on top of the fact that on the Odin 1, you could only play the very simplest Switch games, seeing the leap in performance since the Odin 1 is tremendous. So my hope is that with maybe the Odin 3, I can fully recommend that next device for Nintendo Switch emulation if that's what you're looking for. This device can play Switch games, but it should not be the main thing you buy it for. Because if you do, you'll be setting yourself up for some disappointment. But back to the other systems. GameCube and PS2 is just flawless. The GameCube and PS2 performance was just so amazing. I know I'm circling back to stuff I've already said, but if I'm being honest, I was just so impressed with how flawless it was. I do all my testing at, base resolution, so just the stock resolution, so no increase in scaling. So I was able to end up, I think I went to 2x resolution scaling to see, how hard I can push this thing. I think I've seen people get up to 4 or 6x depending on the game, but I comfortably played 2x resolution scaling on all the games on the PS2 and GameCube I decided to test, and it was phenomenal. It looks amazing. No noticeable performance dip. The fan, while audible, was not annoying to hear. And that's awesome because God knows how loud the Steam Deck's fan is, because holy God. But price. Currently, for early bird pricing, I was able to get it for just under $300 for the base model. And good news for any prospective buyers, right now, AYN is currently doing a bunch of sales, but they're currently out of stock of the base model, which they're currently selling the base model for $300. The Pro is currently being sold for $369, and the Max is currently being sold for $459. And if I'm being honest, I could only really recommend the base model, because spending $369 on this, you could get a Steam Deck with that kind of money. I mean, right now you can get the original base model Steam Deck for $320. And not only will that be able to emulate all of these same systems at basically the same quality, and you might have a better experience emulating Switch games on top of that. And on top of all the emulation stuff you could do, you can also play AAA PC games as they come out. So it's almost a little bit tougher of a recommendation of the Pro and the Max models. But the base model still maintains my recommendation. So at the end of the day, if you want to get the Odin 2, go right ahead. You won't be making a mistake as long as you get the base model. If you do consider getting one of the higher tier models, shop around, you might be able to find something a little bit better for your money. But currently, in my opinion, the base model Odin 2 is the true value emulation king, and something else will have to come to really impress me to knock off the Odin 2 from its current champion spot. So what are your thoughts? Are you going to pick up an Odin 2 after watching this video? Or do you already have an Odin 2 and you want to share your experience so far down below? I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, comments, and concerns down below. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. All that other social media garbage down below. And last but not least, have a wonderful day. Deuces.